latest clothes. Should she grab any man who showed an interest in her fair face and large dowry? She could get engaged to a viscount's son, who nearly declared himself before she ran off to the ladies' retiring room in order to avoid the unpleasant task of saying no. There was another, an older bachelor, who still had all his hair, a sizable yearly income, and a townhouse on the west side of Arlington Street. She was confident she could be mistress of his house by Christmas, if she so chose. In fact, there were half a dozen others who'd shown an interest. If only she could decide to settle. Or should she set her sights on the following year and go home to Juniper Hall in the Surrey countryside? Perhaps cut her hair in the new fashion, or take more music lessons. Maybe she should learn to speak French like Maggie, or attempt to stop talking so much about her interest in commerce. The latter scandalized her mother, yet Ada found most interesting the rise and fall of commodities on the London Stock Exchange. Fluctuations of price could make or break a man between sunrise and sunset. There was the Spanish Panic of 1835, and 4 years after the 1845 crash, newspapers still wrote about the burst bubble from railway speculation. Some very old families indeed had been ruined. Fascinating, Ada thought, whenever she picked up her father's well-read copy of the Banker's Magazine or The Economist. Infinitely more interesting than the silly romantic novels her friends were reading. She could listen for hours to her father espousing about what he encountered on the floor of the exchange, even though he was speaking primarily to her younger brother Grady. Gentlemen in search of a wife, however, didn't want a young woman to have an interest in business. It was too manly. Sighing loudly, Ada let her maid prepare her for yet another end-of-the-season soiree. Yes, the violet silk gown. Yes, her hair up in a braided bun with blonde ringlets hanging from her temples past her ears. Yes, the matching lavender silk gloves, because why not? Yes, yes, yes. Except she didn't want to go. Not really. She looked at her blue eyes in the gilded mirror and hoped they didn't appear as weary as she felt. And then she went to the Fontaine's ball. With her mother in her usual position, seated with the other hopeful mothers nearby, Ada let her card be filled, holding out her wrist dutifully to every young man who asked. When had this become such a dreary chore? The next hour passed in a carousel of dances, the grand march, then a quadrille, polka, and waltz. When her mother wasn't looking, she had a glass of champagne. Waving to Lady Adelia Smythe, the daughter of an earl but still very friendly, who also hadn't found a match, Ada headed toward her when a man bumped her elbow as he brushed past. "Well, excuse me," she said loudly enough that he halted and turned. Intending to take him to task for his rudeness, she pursed her lips and stared up at... Ada had to stop herself from gasping. It was he, at last, her Viscount, Lord Michael Alder. He narrowed his eyes as if studying her, perhaps to see if he knew her. When he didn't, he relaxed and shrugged. "My apologies." Good God, he was speaking to her. His voice sounded as she recalled, rich and deep, causing a delightful shiver in her spine. Say something, she ordered herself, but her tongue was frozen. She could do naught but stare at his handsome face below thick brown hair that curled slightly, giving him a rakish air. She'd never been close enough before to see how, instead of plain brown eyes, his were a striking amber colour. Unusual, reminding her of one of her family's cats. "Are you well?" he asked, undoubtedly thinking her addle-pated as she gaped at him. Nodding, still speechless, she did the only thing she could think of. She held out her wrist with a card dangling from it. He looked at it as if it were on fire, practically recoiling. "No," he said without preamble. "I don't wish to dance." At her distraught expression he added, "Not with anyone," as if to soften the blow. She swallowed. Think of something brilliant, amusing, interesting, anything. Then he nodded quickly, turned away, and disappeared into the throng. Blast! She'd lost her one and only chance. Yet it didn't truly matter. Obviously she held no attraction for him, and whatever word she'd spouted wouldn't have changed that fact. Especially not her personal notion one could become extraordinarily wealthy from investing in the developing technology of undersea cables. The newspapers indicated they would be laid between England and France within 2 years. She ought to have blandly praised the music, the champagne, or even Lord Alder's ascot, or brought up Dickens' latest. Expelling an unladylike puff of air, she sent her